According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, the rate of autism is pretty close to 1 in 100 at this point in time receiving that diagnosis. And as you all know, a preponderance of these children are males. For some reason, they seem to be a little bit more susceptible to these disorders. And when you look at the rapid increase in this diagnosis in this really short period of time, you know, it cannot be a strictly genetic component. Genes do not change that quickly in that short amount of time. So there has to be something else that's triggering this increase in these disorders. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with something called epigenetics, and that is turning on and off a gene based on some type of environmental exposure. And this does mean that there could be something in the environment that can affect your gene. So the actual structure of the chromosome isn't different, but something that's happened environmentally has taken a piece of that gene and turned it on or off, and then causes some differences that we see as the behaviors. And there are some genetic markers for autism. If you can do a chromosome analysis, and they have specialized ones for children with autism, and you can pick up certain abnormalities. But the majority of children with these disorders don't have, you know, abnormal chromosomes. And some of them may not have abnormal chromosomes, but they have some genetic defects in chemical processing that, you know, you can diagnose and say you have this. There's no cure for it. You can intervene with nutrition and supplements. But the majority of children don't have any of these, or that we have identified yet. Let's put it that way. So let's a little bit about epigenetics. Like I said, it's a turning on and off of a gene based on whether or not there's a specific methyl group, which is just a carbon and a hydrogen that's attached and turns it on or off. And this can be a way of seeing a rapid increase in a diagnosis that is somewhat genetic but driven by the environment. And this is something that can have an impact for years. So, you know, something can happen to the mother in her environment that impacts her genetics, and then that's translated into the child, and they then show the signs of what happened to the mother. So the environment impacts the expression of the genes. And so these genes that are turned on or off might be responsible for some of the important, you know, chemical processing that goes on in our body, and may be responsible for some of the behaviors that you see in the children. There's something called the multiple hit hypothesis, as it refers to neurodevelopmental disorders, and specifically autism spectrum disorders. One is that, you know, there's a small group of children who do have a detectable chromosomal abnormality. Then you have the other epigenetic influence with environmental triggers affecting the genes. There's also the possibility of recurrent infections, chronic inflammation, problems with the immune system. So this would be another category of things that can be going on that can drive the development of autism. Another group of problems that can lead to this diagnosis would be functional deficiencies of vitamins, or an inappropriate immune system response to certain things that you're ingesting. So that would be certain foods that you're eating that you may not have an allergy to that sends you to the emergency room, but that your body is kind of intolerant to, so it causes this constant upregulation of your immune system, which then triggers other problems. Detoxification deficits. Everything that you ingest, from water to food to medicines, whether they're prescription or over-the-counter, all have to go through your system and come out your body in one shape or form or the other. And your liver plays a big role in this, and there's very specific chemical steps that have to be taken. So if your body isn't doing that appropriately, then you can kind of have a toxic load. And, you know, if you have one or two things that are not getting taken care of, it may not present a problem. But if you're not functioning at your optimum level, and you have multiple things that you're being exposed to, and your body isn't getting rid of them appropriately, that is another way that you can see some of the signs and symptoms, you know, that we see with children on the spectrum. Other environmental exposures may be the foods that you're eating, the hormones that are in the foods that children are consuming, other types of exposures, whether they be topical, injection. So there's multiple ways that these toxic loads can get into your body, and it's just a matter of how good is your body at getting rid of them. And everyone does this differently. And this doesn't apply just to children on the spectrum. This applies to everyone in this room. You know, everyone in this room, you know, will take things and get rid of them quicker or slower than the other person. And this is just kind of a summary of what we talked about. you kind of have a genetic predisposition to developing a neurodevelopmental disorder. There's environmental triggers that might cause it to happen. So a nice little analogy is that genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So if you're not genetically predisposed to have this happen, you can have all of these insults and you're going to be perfectly fine. And there's multiple examples of this in medicine in general. I mean, smoking is a great one. The majority of people who smoke will not get lung cancer. But you don't know if you're the person who's going to get lung cancer until you get it. And at that point in time, it's too late. So, diabetes. You don't know if you're the person who's going to develop diabetes, but you're genetically predisposed to it. Something triggers it, and then you have it. So this is not a specific to just children with autism. So autism is a multi-system disorder. It's not a psychiatric diagnosis. You have neurologic abnormalities in the things that you see, and when you go look at the nervous system, you see some abnormalities there on the exam. If you were to go and do brain biopsies, which we're not recommending, but you will find abnormalities. There you will find inflammatory markers. There are gastrointestinal problems with a lot of these children that are driving some of the behaviors. There are immune system dysfunctions. A lot of these children are chronically ill, and those chronic illnesses were first, and then they develop the signs and symptoms of autism. Some of them remain chronically ill. A lot of them have allergy problems. Almost any food they eat bothers them. Multiple environmental allergens bother them. Biochemical, metabolic problems, kind of going back to the problem with detoxifying. A lot of the children have some difficulties with some of their B vitamins and have some functional deficiencies there. Endocrine systems. A lot of the children, their endocrine systems are kind of upregulated. So they're, if you think of someone who's under a lot of stress, it changes the way their hormones are put out in their body. And you can imagine a child who has autism is kind of in a chronic state of stress. They're always in motion. They are kind of anxious appearing. They're not ever calm and relaxed. And their endocrine system plays a role in there. And if you go and test with some of these children, you can find some abnormalities in some of these endocrine markers. And a lot of children who have ADHD and ADD also will have some of these similar abnormalities if you do lab testing on them. There is not one lab test that you can do. There's not one diagnostic test that you can do to say this person has autism or this person has attention deficit disorder. And they're considered diagnostically two separate disorders, but when you really start to see children over and over again with these diagnoses, there's a whole lot of crossover. I mean, you have a child who's got attention deficit disorder and you really pay attention, they've got some fine sensory issues going on. They might have some socialization problems. A lot of children with autism are extremely hyper. So there's a lot of crossover here, and that's why we like to say neurodevelopmental spectrum. So we don't, instead of giving a child 5 diagnoses, okay, you have autism, you have ADHD, you have sensory integration disorder, it's all part of the same underlying process.